If what they're doing, if they actually like achieve a good result, if it turns out that they actually can, when playing this game, get expert number 2 to produce, very close, likenesses of each pot based on the list of 50 numbers that expert number 1 sends her. What this means really is that the sort of combinatorial space of all the pots that expert number 2 would produce, given sort of like all possible combinations, given all possible 50 numbers long lists of like numbers going from like 1 to 9, is in fact the space of all possible Greek pots. And that would mean that in fact every classical Greek pot that is or was or ever could be can be understood at some structural level as emerging out of the interplay of sort of like 50 fundamental structural forces, that interact in a way that's sort of like analytically intractable, but is cognitively tractable through like the Gestalt understanding of an expert. But nevertheless, it sort of like means that all Greek pots in the world, all possible Greek pots, are sort of like, the shadows on like, the shadows playing on the wall of like Plato's cave. And this is sort of like 50 sort of like abstract qualities are like, like the objects casting the shadows of on the wall. Like all possible classical Greek pots emerge out of like the interplay between the relative degrees of strength of these like 50 primal structural forces. And what that means, in fact, is that we can understand classical Greek pottery as a space with 50 dimensions, such that the sort of like, the agree-disagree rating, for each of the 50, descriptive statements, is the location of a particular classical Greek pot along the dimension represented by the question. And really, all classical Greek pots are points on this 50-dimensional Euclidean space. Now, this space, which let's call it, classical Greek pottery space, which is the 50-dimensional space where each point is a classical Greek pot, and each dimension traveling along the dimension is the same as, varying the strength with which one of the 50 statements applies. Now, one thing we know about this space is that it also exists, within another like larger space. So it's going to be sort of like a million or like what have you, like a dimensional space, where the space of classical Greek pots is going to be what we call technically a lower dimensional submanifold, and informally it's something sort of like the generalization to higher dimension of the way that like a thin twisty ribbon in 3 dimensions relates to the space of a room. So it turns out something like the space of classical Greek pots can be understood as this lower dimensional submanifold, this sort of like thin, twisty like ribbon within the space of all possible objects. And really knowing how to move within classical Greek pot space also means knowing how to move within all possible object space in a way that doesn't fall off the manifold of classical Greek pot. That is, by virtue of knowing how to sort of like give like the recipe for any classical Greek pot, the experts also know, I mean, by virtue, I mean, it's like, it sort of like formally ends up being the same thing expressed mathematically. They also know how to move in the space of all possible objects, sort of like learning to like understand or like to grasp a certain class of things in terms of the similarities and differences between things within this class, like learning how to compare and contrast Greek pots, in such a way that you could like sort of like use this Gestalt knowledge of how to compare and contrast Greek pots with one another to do this, compact encoded communication is formally equivalent to like knowing how to tell the difference between a Greek pot and not a Greek pot. That is, it's the same as knowing how to tell what makes something a Greek pot at all.